Buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into something that might just turn your view of those biology textbooks upside down.
Oh, sounds intriguing. What do we have on the agenda?
We're tackling Darwin, evolution, the whole shebang.
Usual, then.
Not quite. We're looking at it all through, well, a bit of a different lens this time.
Right.
A perspective that brings together Orthodox Christianity and, get this, a belief in a young Earth.
Now, that's an interesting combination. What's the source material for this deep dive?
It's an article called Baptizing Darwin, and let me tell you, it certainly makes you think about things in a new light.
So are they trying to make Darwin like an honorary saint or something?
Haha, not quite. But the article does argue that you can be a Christian and still accept at least some aspects of evolutionary theory.
Okay, so right off the bat, they're wading to some pretty deep theological waters. What aspects are we talking about here?
Well, the article makes a distinction between what it calls microevolution and macroevolution.
Those terms ring a bell. Microevolution is like small-scale changes within a species, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Think about the different breeds of dogs, for example.
Right, like from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. All those variations came from a common ancestor.
Exactly. And the article argues that this kind of evolution, microevolution, fits perfectly fine within a creationist worldview.
So you could say that dog breeding is like a human-directed form of microevolution.
Precisely. But then there's macroevolution, which is where things get a bit more, shall we say, controversial.
Macroevolution is about those bigger leaps, right? Like one species evolving into a completely different one.
Exactly. The classic example is reptiles evolving into birds. And that's where the article draws a bit of a line in the sand.
So microevolution, thumbs up. Macroevolution, not so much.
That's the gist of it. But here's where I find it gets really interesting.
All ears.
The article challenges this very common idea that evolution equals progress.
Oh, I can see where this is going. That whole survival of the fittest idea can make it seem like evolution is always pushing towards bigger, better, more complex organisms.
Exactly. But the article points out that adaptation, which is, of course, a key part of evolution, often involves losing something, not gaining it.
Oh, like a trade-off.
Precisely. And they use a fascinating example, cave fish. You know, those fish that live in caves?
I've seen pictures. Some of them have lost their eyes completely, right?
Yeah. Over generations, they adapted to living in complete darkness, and somewhere along the way, they lost their sight.
It's kind of a stark example of how adapting to one environment can mean giving up something that might be essential in another.
Exactly. And that leads us to this concept of genetic entropy, which the article leans on pretty heavily.
Okay, entropy. Now that one rings a bell, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Well, in the simplest terms, genetic entropy suggests that over time, the genetic information within a species can actually degrade.
Degrade, like a copy of a copy.
That's a great way to put it. Each generation, there's a chance for small errors, little bits of genetic information to get lost or corrupted.
So it's not always about things getting better and better.
Not necessarily. The article suggests that, at least from a genetic perspective, there might actually be a natural tendency towards a decline in complexity.
Yeah, that really challenges the traditional narrative of evolution, doesn't it?
It sure does. And the article even recommends a book if you want to really dive deep into this whole concept of genetic entropy. Genetic Entropy by Dr. John C. Sanford.
Noted. I'll have to check that out. So we've got this idea of genetic information potentially going downhill over time.
So we've got this idea of genetic information potentially going downhill over time, which, kind of makes you wonder how that squares with the whole biblical creation story.
Right, because if genetic entropy is a thing, wouldn't that make things pretty messy pretty quickly?
Exactly. And that's where the article takes another interesting turn. It proposes this framework. And it might surprise you.
Oh, I do love a good surprise. Lay it on me.
Okay, so they suggest that when God created those original prototype species, he packed a whole lot of genetic diversity into them.
Like front-loaded with diversity.
Yeah, exactly. And over time, those species adapted and diversified, filling the Earth with the incredible variety of life we see today.
So instead of creating each individual species separately, it's like God created these prototypes with the potential for variation already built in.
That's the basic idea. And this built-in diversity, they argue, allowed for adaptation and speciation without needing new kinds of organisms to just pop into existence.
Okay, I'm following so far. But this is where my brain starts to go to some of those tricky passages in the Bible. Like those super long lifespans in the Old Testament, and Adam and Eve being the ancestors of everyone.
Ah, yeah, the old genetic bottleneck problem.
Exactly. Wouldn't that much inbreeding cause some serious issues, especially if genetic entropy is happening in the background?
It's a great question. And here's where the young Earth perspective really comes into play. Because if the Earth is relatively young, there hasn't been that much time for genetic entropy to have a huge impact.
Right, like in that copy of a copy analogy, the closer you are to the original, the less degradation you'd expect.
Exactly. So Adam and Eve, starting out with this incredibly robust genetic makeup.
Fresh off the divine assembly line.
Haha, right. And then, as time passes, the effects of genetic entropy slowly become more pronounced.
Like a slow hiss of air from a tire. You might not notice it at first, but eventually.
You're going to have a problem. That's a great analogy. But, it makes me think about another potential conflict here.
What's that?
Didn't Darwin's theory pretty much challenge the whole idea of a divine creator?
Well, that's how it's often been interpreted.
Yeah.
But this article, well, get this. It argues that from an evolutionary standpoint, religiosity, even traditionalism, might actually be more advantageous than atheism.
Whoa, hold on. That's not what I expected. I always figured evolution would favor rationality and scientific thinking, not blind faith.
It's a natural assumption.
Hmm.
But the article throws a real curveball with that one. They even bring in the work of people like Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Edward Dutton.
Oh, I've heard of them. Peterson talks about those psychological benefits of religious belief, right? And Dutton, he does some fascinating stuff with evolutionary psychology. But how does that all tie back to evolution?
Well, Dutton, for example, he argues that humans actually evolved to be religious and traditional as a way, he says, of ensuring the survival of their communities.
So it's not really about whether those religious beliefs are literally true, but more about the social glue they provide.
That's a big part of it. Religion, in Dutton's view, gave people a framework for cooperation, morality, a sense of belonging, all things that would have been vital for early human groups to survive.
So the article is suggesting that faith, even if it might seem irrational at first glance, could actually be seen as an evolutionary advantage.
It's a very provocative idea. It really makes you question those assumptions we often make.
It's like they're turning the whole survival of the fittest thing on its head.
It really is a different way of thinking about it.
Instead of just raw competition, they're saying that cooperation, a shared sense of meaning, maybe those have been even more important for us to survive.
It's definitely thought-provoking. And, it makes you think about how we tend to see evolution as this purely material process. This article, it's pushing us to consider that maybe there's room for a creator in that picture, and that maybe, just maybe, faith and evolution aren't as opposed as we often think.
I've got to say, this deep dive has given me a whole lot to chew on. Never thought Darwin would be the topic to make me rethink, well, everything.
That's the beauty of these deep dives, right? Always something new to discover.
You're telling me it's like this article took everything I thought I knew about evolution, shook it up, and put it all back together in a whole new way.
And sometimes that's how we learn and grow, by being willing to question those assumptions we have.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of questioning assumptions, you mentioned a book earlier, Genetic Entropy.
By Dr. John C. Sanford.
Right, by Dr. John C. Sanford. If anyone listening wants to go even deeper into this idea of genetic information degrading, that sounds like the place to start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating read, even if you don't agree with everything in it. And that's really what matters, right? Engaging in these ideas, having these conversations.
Well said. Well, until next time, everybody, keep those brains buzzing. And remember, the most fascinating journeys often take us down the most unexpected paths.